Dr. Mark Goodman.
Hey, Matt.
You're my go-to sports medicine and human performance optimization guru. So since I've got you on the phone, I need a favor. So a couple weeks ago, I got a phone call. Mike and I were invited to go, and we're going to be riding with some professional cyclists here in a couple weeks. So all I need from you really is I sent you my genetics, and I just need to maybe double my endurance, increase my strength by about 50%, and lose about 15 pounds in 2 weeks to get my wattage to kilogram ratio up about 80%.
Yeah.
Is that
no, I think that sounds totally reasonable. Yeah. What? Let's start with your genetics.
All right.
That's a big ask. I think training, rest, diet, and recovery are going to all play a key role in this, but I'm not sure that 2 weeks is a realistic time frame. But I think it does bring up some interesting points on how genetics play into athletic performance, and maybe there's a few things we can do to optimize what you're already doing.
Well, look, the time's ticking. I've got 13.9 days now, so let's get into it.
Are you on the bike right now? You better be on the bike while we're talking.
You'd be recording this podcast while on a bike.
I'm between intervals right now, so I can talk
good.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Hey there, I'm Mike.
And I'm Matt.
And I'm Jody. The Wild Health Podcast is our quest into human performance, longevity, and personalized medicine. Together, along with experts in these fields, we'll learn how to live longer, better, and become smarter and stronger. We'll do the deep dive into the research and hard work of putting it all together, and you reap the benefits.
All right, so that's a little ridiculous. Probably not going to have that sort of performance improvement over the next 2 weeks, Matt. But I think,
do you even own a bike?
I'm a member of a gym that has a bike trainer, so I figure I'm good.
It should be fine.
Yeah, you're gonna do just fine.
Or you could use one of your kids' bikes. I mean, they're like 10, right?
Yeah, no, it's funny. When we were on the phone with them, with someone who we were talking to, they said, I can ride with this, right? And I said, yeah, no problem. I've done a couple Ironmans, and my wife overheard me. When I hung up, she said, you forgot to mention you literally haven't been on a bike in 8 years. So I do need a little help. So
let me know how this goes. I've got a good feeling about
it. If you do have to borrow your kid's bike, at least if you're doing intervals on a tricycle, you don't have to worry about falling over at the end of the interval.
And it has a sweet bill.
All right, so Mark came at me recently with this list of all of these SNPs and all of this interventions to be performing for nutrigenomics in athletes. And we felt like it would be a great opportunity to bring to the podcast and sort of show some of the opportunity that we have in our athletic patients and how we can really optimize their performance. So we wanted to have Mark on, and then we thought this would be a great opportunity because Matt is in such horrible shape. We could talk about how we could try to get him in better shape over the course of the next 2 weeks, which is an insurmountable feat. But Mark, where should we start here? What would we do to Matt in terms of optimizing his food ingestion, the type of activity he's performing to try to get faster, to get leaner? Where do we start?
Or just humans in general. I mean, we'll talk specifically about me, but Mike and I and Mark, we have we have some professional athletes and people trying to optimize. And anytime we have a really difficult question, Dr. Goodman's who we go to. So I think we need to share his knowledge with everybody. So just in general, how would you start?
Sure. And I think to preface this whole kind of conversation, I think we need to get back to the basics of what you guys have been doing a really good job talking about so far. I think the individual SNPs here and some of these maybe small interventions are really kind of a drop in the bucket, and they're maybe the last 5% or maybe even last 1%. But this really requires a base that's really based in a good diet, good training strategies, good recovery, all the things that you guys have been discussing so far, and some of the kind of key things that we talk about with patients when they come in. And I think that is really required as the building blocks to add some of this other stuff on. So, we talked about this before, but you can't out-train a bad diet, and you can't outperform or overperform or even live up to your potential when you're not training well and eating well and sleeping well. So I just want to, be sure we get that out in the open before we start talking about some of these maybe more individualized interventions and get into the world of supplements and things like that. So, but after saying that, I think there are a couple things, Matt, when we looked at your genetics that maybe could be useful. And when we're talking about sports genetics, this is kind of a new and interesting world, and the data out there on this stuff is okay, but it is certainly not great. So I think we're really in the stages now where we're starting to figure out what genes affect sports performance. And a lot of times those are things that affect not maybe a direct outcome of strength, but it's a biomarker. So something like looking at vitamin D levels or iron levels, and then seeing how that affects your injury risk, your recovery. But at this point, there's not really a whole lot of great data that guides, like, if you have this one genotype, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So what we try and look at is maybe you have these certain SNPs that can give us some clues to what's going on as far as if you're going to be more prone to injury, how you're going to recover, what we can do to optimize maybe your macronutrient ratios or some other things to work on optimizing the other parts of your diet and your training. And this whole idea of this gene-diet interaction and finding ways that we can optimize your genetics by how you eat and how you sleep and how you train. So I think that's the big thing. So, Matt, when we look through your levels and look through some of your labs and then your genetics, I think there are a couple of things we can be working on. So part of this is focusing on your recovery and then looking at some specific kind of macronutrients. So when we start looking through things, Matt has a couple things we look at as far as iron absorption. So, iron is one of the key things we look for, and especially in people who are endurance athletes. So we know that you can have a low iron store, a total body iron store, which is typically measured by a ferritin level that can influence your performance, can also cause some systemic symptoms. And you can see that sometimes before you actually go on to develop anemia, which is typically what we look for in medicine. We look if someone has a significant anemia, which is a sign that those total body stores are actually really low. So there's a
real quick question, Mark.
Yeah.
This is Jody, longtime listener, first time caller. Is it true that too much iron will make you magnetic?
Okay, that's Jody's only question for the day.
It could help if Matt's on a bike. He might not fall off if he can be magnetic.
Maybe use it as an engine.
Yeah,
exactly.
Quick question for you, Mark, just for the listeners. So you were talking about ferritin levels. So what exactly is ferritin? It's not actually serum iron, right? It's something different.
Yeah. So we think that measuring serum iron probably is not all that useful because it doesn't give us a great idea of what your total body iron stores are. So measuring ferritin is thought to be a more kind of ideal measure of what the actual amount of body iron that you have is, what your iron stores are. So that's what we typically look at. And we're looking for a ferritin level, ideally between 30 and 50 typically is kind of a number that we'll use. And we know that sometimes that ferritin level can be low even before you'll see a decrease in your red blood cell count or your hemoglobin or hematocrit, which can be an indicator for anemia. And this is something you'd have to approach with caution because there are some certain genetic SNPs that would modify your ability to process iron. And one of those is that HFE gene that we've talked about, I think, before. And so when we look through Matt's genetics, we know that maybe if you have this HFE modification, it would make you more prone to iron overload, which in that case, supplementing with iron could be something you might want to avoid. So this is something we really need to put the genetic and the laboratory data together to come up with an individualized plan based on that person.
And Mark, what does that HFE gene stand for?
The HFE gene is the human hemochromatosis gene that codes for a protein that's primarily found in the intestinal cells and regulates how your body uptakes iron. So people that have mutations can sometimes take up too much iron, leading to iron overload. So it's something we want to look at before starting iron supplementation.
So basically people with an HFE gene, we just need to be, or a gene SNP, we need to be careful with supplementation with iron in those people because we could take their iron too high and increase their risk of chronic disease like dementia, cardiovascular disease, things like that. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Exactly. And we know that too much iron is not beneficial and it can be harmful by increasing free radical production and systemic inflammation as well.
Yeah. And so for me, I have the normal GG allele. So it looks like I really just need to probably measure my level basically and make sure that's optimized right. And then not really worry about the consumption unless my level is too high or too low.
Exactly. And this would be more of a problem to you, Matt. I know you eat meat, so you're probably getting plenty of iron in your diet. If someone like Mike, where we were testing this, who doesn't eat a ton of red meat or maybe has a lower dietary amount of iron, then that'd be something we'd be looking at. And so, also in women, it'd be something we would definitely look at a little bit more.
How would you go about changing the way that you're taking care of a patient if they have that SNP, Mark?
I think I'd just be really reluctant to start someone on supplemental iron if they do have an HFE modification. So I'd be measuring their transferrin levels and their ferritin measuring their ferritin levels frequently to be sure we're not sending them into a state of iron overload, because that'd be something that'd be concerning.
So you mentioned briefly, Mark, people who are at high risk of having iron deficiencies. I think you said vegans and women. Anybody else that we need to take into consideration when we're evaluating for iron levels?
So we just think that there's an increasing demand from intense training, and especially endurance training. There's a theory that you have maybe some hemolysis with foot strike and people who are
I've heard
serious
this.
runners, which is, I think, debated a little bit. But there could be just a role that increasing your overall inflammation from intense training decreases your body's ability to uptake iron efficiently.
Maybe this is why people are always talking about run like you're on eggshells.
Yeah,
So you don't
light.
hemolyze all of your red blood cells.
There's certain medications that can also decrease your ability to take up iron. So things like proton pump inhibitors, things that decrease your body's ability to take up iron in the gut. And then we know that maybe vitamin C deficiency can also lead to decreased iron uptake as well. So supplementing with vitamin C as well as iron can be beneficial.
And isn't there a SNP for actual absorption of iron as well?
So yeah, there's another SNP that we looking at iron absorption, which is the TMPRS6 and the TFR2. And those regulate hepcidin expression, and hepcidin controls how iron is absorbed in the gut. So when you increase the amount of hepcidin you have, it actually downregulates your ability to absorb iron from your dietary sources. And hepcidin can be upregulated for training or inflammation, a variety of reasons. But if you do have one of these SNPs, you might have more hepcidin, which decreases your body's ability to take up iron from your diet.
So would you then put that person on IV iron, or just increase the amount of supplemental oral?
I think first starting with trying increasing oral iron if you can tolerate it. There are some side effects to oral iron supplementation. But then if that's still not working, but if someone has symptomatic anemia, we're trying oral iron, then trying IV iron replacement is certainly reasonable to consider.
Awesome. Yeah, this stuff I think is super applicable, not just in athletes. I mean, I'm seeing, in our patients, probably a quarter of our patients have some sort of dyscrasias of their iron labs. And that doesn't mean we necessarily are intervening on a quarter of our patients, but there's a lot to this. And iron is not a very straightforward medical problem for sure. And there's a lot that goes into it in terms of deciding when to supplement, if to supplement,
Sure.
the risk of supplementation.
Yeah, and I think this idea of this non-anemic iron deficiency where you have a low ferritin with potentially minor symptoms is something that's becoming more recognized as well, and definitely something I've been more in tune to, but hadn't really heard of before a couple of years ago.
Well, I think the ferritin is an interesting one too, with precision medicine, because we also think about that as an acute phase reactant. So some of our patients were worried if it's too high because there could be inflammation going on, whereas our elite athletes were worried about being too low. So
Sure.
the levels kind of depend on the person and the goals also.
Well, and you have to take that ferritin level, and you also have to look at your other acute phase reaction markers. So, I mean, I know, testing or looking at Mike's labs, the ferritin was potentially high, but then the CRP was also up, and we thought maybe that was related to an intense workout ahead of time and before getting his blood tested. So I think you have to take that in context, and that's why it does get a little bit tricky. There's not a one-size-fits-all recommendation. You have to sit down and look at someone's labs and genetics and come up with a plan.
Yeah, and also the ferritin's elevated with insulin resistance as well. So if you're dealing with somebody who's got some metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance, it's going to be elevated there, and it's not because of elevated serum iron. So
Sure.
yeah, a lot goes into this for sure.
And then if you start looking at, hemochromatosis, it's usually over 1,000 when you start worrying about liver damage and things like that. So that's definitely a level that we would be pretty reluctant to look at. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But yeah, this stuff gets, you can get into the weeds on this in a hurry.
Yeah, speaking about the weeds, you can actually see like these increased reactive oxygen species secondary to elevated ferritin levels, and which can cause liver damage, and we can actually test for that too. So sometimes we're actually testing specific liver enzymes in patients with elevated ferritin levels. So yeah, I feel like we're in the weeds.
I think that one of the take-home points on this is that supplementing with iron just routinely across the board is something you'd want to shy away from unless you've actually had a laboratory test done. I think just recommending supplements for the sake of taking supplements is not beneficial. And this is something that could actually decrease your performance if you're taking iron and you don't particularly need it, or it could land you in a bad spot.
I remember when I was a teenager and I moved to this place that was actually, I wasn't really a teenager. I was like my early 20s, but I moved to this place that was over 7,000 feet. And I was like, I need to take iron. I gotta increase my hemoglobin.
Turns out you're just out of shape.
I started taking a bunch of iron, and
Yeah,
I don't think it did anything.
Yeah.
So, Mark, my iron is good. I'm at 100. So what about, I've got this DNA Fit. A long time ago, I did this program. It told me I'm 83% endurance versus 17% power.
Yeah.
Do I need to modify anything? Tell me about that, what you know about that.
Yeah, I think the data around this is really interesting. I think it is tough, though, to apply this on an individual level. So there was a study back in 2016 that looked at this DNA fit data. They took 15 SNPs and they broke people down into people that were exercising based on their kind of power versus endurance genotype. And then they measured their performance at a couple different tests over time. So one of them was a 3-minute cycling test, which may be more relevant to you. The other one was a more strength-based test of explosive power. And they found that people who trained based on their genotype had a better response to that kind of training. So people that had more of a power type genotype did a low intensity training program, and they did better on both metrics, as well as people who had an endurance genotype. They did more of an endurance based or a high rep, low weight kind of program, got better improvements when they trained in that manner. So I think it is interesting. And I think maybe tailoring your training based on that could be useful. So, if you're in the gym, maybe choosing to do things that are a little bit lower weight, higher rep. Now, that being said, I think there's also some really big benefits to the idea of periodization in your workout. So, you don't want to get stagnant and just be doing the same thing over and over because you think that meets your DNA or fits your DNA. I think you need to be changing. There is something changing volume, changing intensity, and kind of keeping things different in the gym and on the bike that's going to have benefit not only in your mental health, but in your training over time. But that being said, because you have more of an endurance kind of lean to your genetics, you might consider adding in some more endurance type training, and you could see some benefits to that more quickly. Whether you're going to get the benefit in the next 2 weeks, that's a little bit difficult to say.
So how would you recommend Matt lift weights? If he's, I guess, in this setting where he's trying to improve his endurance, would he do high reps, low reps, high number sets, low number sets?
Yeah. So, this study looked at people who are doing 3 sets of 10 reps for 2 weeks, and then 3 sets of 15 for 3 weeks, and then 3 sets of 20 for the last 3 weeks. So that would be a good way to increase your endurance. That being said, I think if you're really trying to get faster on the bike, you need to be on the bike.
Get off this podcast now.
Yeah, you need to stop talking on the phone and you need to go ride your bike. Yeah. I think that's what gets you faster. There's a role, I think, for cross training and lifting in the off season, but people who are serious cyclists, they're spending a lot more time actually riding and doing some structured work on the bike at this point, trying to get ready for an event.
Well, and it's important what you said earlier about we have to keep in mind just basic exercise science as well. And even though maybe I'm a little more predisposed to make better gains from endurance, if I've got a few weeks and I really want to sharpen, it's going to be interval training, right? As long as I don't overdo that and get injured, even no matter what my genetics say, we know that that's probably going to give me the biggest bang for the buck. So we have to put all this into context.
Would totally agree. And it depends what you're training for. If you're training for a CrossFit competition, your training is going to look a lot different than if you're training to go ride a Grand Fondo and ride 100 miles.
And Mark, what was that one SNP you were telling me about? It was something about if you lift weights, you're going to get super fat. That's all I remember you telling me.
I think we were talking about the INSIG2 gene. And this is a gene that has an interesting polymorphism where people who carry a C or a CC allele actually have an increased risk of subcutaneous adiposity with resistance training. And there was a study in 2008 that looked at this, and men especially who carried one of the C alleles or SNPs at this location actually gained subcutaneous fat in response to resistance training. So I think this maybe could help guide some of your recommendations for someone's exercise program. And a person that does carry that C allele maybe will want them doing a little bit more endurance work as opposed to straight strength training.
Yeah, and maybe that's going to depend a little bit on your goals. If you're already pretty lean and you're just trying to get strong, then gaining a couple percentage points of body fat's not going to be the end of your life. But at the same time, like if you're trying to get lean, you definitely don't want to be doing something that's going to increase adiposity.
Absolutely, and like a lot of these other SNPs that we've talked about, this was a pretty small study and it's certainly limited, but it does give you something to think about. Maybe if we're really trying to take a personalized approach, this is something that you could do an N of 1 study on yourself, and it might help guide you in one direction or another.
So Mark, there's a decent chance, I think, that Matt's going to get injured in the next 2 weeks trying to prepare for this bike ride. Are there any SNPs that he has specifically, or just things that we should be cognizant of in terms of injury and recovery for our athletes?
So a couple different things that we can look at along those lines. So, I think optimizing your vitamin D levels and then taking a look at the SNPs that would predispose you to not absorbing vitamin D. And that might help reduce inflammation, decrease your chance of getting sick before an event like this, and also increase your ability to recover between high intensity training sessions. So Matt, you have a SNP that predisposes you to having increased risk of deficiency. So I'm sure you've had your vitamin D tested, but just being sure that we're on top of that. And then also looking at things like vitamin C potentially as well. So we know that vitamin C is kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to training. And I think there's some data out there showing that actually high doses of vitamin C can actually blunt your training response. And one of the theories here is that the reactive oxygen species and some of the inflammation that you generate by training is actually a signaling molecule that tells your body to adapt. And if you take too much vitamin C or antioxidants, maybe you're blunting that response. You're not going to get the same amount of benefit from that training. There are some studies, though, showing that if you have a low dose of vitamin C paired with collagen, so about 250 milligrams along with 15 grams of collagen an hour before training, that maybe that can increase your collagen synthesis and help you.
This is a great question. So I recently posted my shoulder shake on Instagram, and immediately somebody commented, and they were like, "Well, what about the vitamin C and blunting the hormetic response to training?" And I think that's a great question. A question I'd like to pose to you. And we actually had another patient who asked this specifically of you. How do you balance that? It's sort of a balancing act, right? The hormetic response from training versus, this potential for increased collagen production. Like, how do you decide when to go which direction?
And I think the bottom line is we don't know for sure. I think taking lower doses of vitamin C probably gives you the most benefit without the idea that you're going to decrease that training response. I'd also say maybe taking that shake or the vitamin C on days where you're not doing a heavy training load on your recovery days or on your rest day could be something that's beneficial as well. And then backing off a little bit on days that you're going to go out and either lift or ride, do something really heavy where you're going to put in a lot of training.
So just to sum those things up real quick, and I want to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. Vitamin D, I have a SNP that makes me likely to be deficient. So I do take that every day because there's studies showing that it's going to reduce my risk of having respiratory illness, reduce my risk of potentially having other problems with bone health and immunity. And those are things I'm worried about when I'm training hard. Vitamin C, we get an oxidative response. We get inflammation from working out. We always think about decreasing inflammation, but we want a little bit of inflammation in that hormetic response. That's how we get stronger and better. And taking a big dose of vitamin C could blunt that. So I may not get as good of a response from my training if I take a high dose vitamin C. So me personally, I generally have avoided vitamin C on days when I'm going to work out hard, and I will take it on days where I feel like maybe my HRV is low or I feel like I'm getting ill and I'm not going to work out. But you're telling me I could also take a low dose, maybe 250 milligrams a day, and maybe get some of the benefits without the problems from it? Is that how you would read the literature on that, Mark?
I would, and the studies on this are pretty small, but I think that would be a reasonable starting point. And I think this is kind of in the same discussion we had with iron. More is not always better, and just because this supplement works for you doesn't mean it's the right thing for everyone else. So I think you have to pair it with your training goals and your laboratory studies and take it in context.
What about a couple other specific nutrients, folate and choline? We talk about those a lot. I'm talking about SNPs in general. My MTHFR genotype, I'm normal there, so I'm not really worried. What about athletes if they aren't normal, if they have a risk there with the MTHFR gene?
Yeah, no, that's great that you already know your MTHFR status and you're on top of it. I think looking at your homocysteine levels is going to be the first thing when we look at MTHFR, because as Mike's talked about before, and just because you have an MTHFR SNP, you could have still normal function. Your homocysteine could be in the normal range. But we do think that high homocysteine levels are probably detrimental to muscle function and strength. So lowering that homocysteine level is going to be something that's going to benefit you not only from a cardiovascular disease risk standpoint, but could also help your athletic performance as well. And then talking about choline, I think this is a super interesting area to look into. And we know there is some kind of correlation here between choline as a methyl donor and its role in folate metabolism and how much dietary choline you're getting. So looking at some SNPs there, not only in the PEMT gene, but the MTHFD1 gene can give us some clues on whether you're likely to be choline deficient. And then we can maybe steer your diet towards correcting that. And I think with any of these things, ideally we try and make interventions based on your diet first before adding in a bunch of pills and supplements that you're taking. And I think we can get you there on a lot of things just by changing maybe how you eat or adding in a few things into your diet.
And both of these, the folate and choline, if you're deficient in them, we think that they lead to muscle dysfunction and muscle damage potentially. And we know that choline's extremely important for the production of creatine. So if you don't have enough choline, presumably you're not producing enough creatine in your body, which maybe that's something we should consider supplementing in those patients with those SNPs.
Yeah, definitely. And we think that choline is also really important in recovering and repairing muscles after a hard training stimulus as well.
Yeah, and I specifically take creatine every day. I do have this PMT gene that gives me a little bit reduced synthesis there, and so I definitely supplement with creatine because of that. And also, I'm just cognizant of maybe eggs, increasing eggs. An egg has, I think, about 150 to 200 milligrams of choline in it, and kind of a regular a recommendation is about 500. So usually 2 or 3 eggs are going to get you pretty close to your daily allowance there. So.
Yeah, and as you know, just being sure that you're getting the egg yolk and not just eating egg whites, because that's what's going to get you more of your choline.
Yeah, and this is exactly the reason why my vegan patients, I put them all on creatine. I think there's a clear benefit in those patients because they just naturally have a decreased choline ingestion, and a lot of those patients end up needing choline supplementation as well.
What about my overall macros in general? Like, should I adjust my diet at all? Looking at SNPs, kind of how would you design the optimal diet?
Are you still only eating bone broth and organ meat, or have you come off that a little bit?
Actually, literally today, the only thing I've had is bone broth so far. So, yeah. Well, and actually, I don't know if I should say this on the bone broth that I had earlier had a sheep testicle in it. So technically, I did have bone broth and organ meat today already.
That's not really bone broth. If it's got a testicle in it, that's ball broth.
Yeah. So anywho.
Sure. And I think making some general recommendations based on genetics can be useful. That being said, I think I'm shying a little bit more away from strict macronutrient ratios and recommending strict macro ratios in people and trying to get people to eat just high quality vegetables, nutrient dense foods. And then things tend to kind of fall into line after that. Once you start cutting out simple sugars and processed foods, I think you can get yourself 80 to 90% of the way there. I think there are a few interesting things about, looking at your FTO genotypes and maybe some of the PPAR and other things that allow you to process fat and could give you some clues on whether you're going to do well on more of a high fat or a ketogenic type diet versus someone who's not going to do well there. And I'm not going to rehash the stuff that you guys already talked about in the diet episode, but when you look through Matt's genotypes, he has a pretty normal association between FTO and PPAR that allows him to do pretty well with a high saturated fat content diet. I think there is some debate as far as whether that's beneficial for performance. And, in athletes that are training for some shorter duration, higher intensity events, I'm not convinced that being on a ketogenic diet is really beneficial. If you're looking to perform at an ultra marathon level, or you're going to really, switch your metabolism to a fat metabolism, and you're going to be on a 24-hour ultra, then I think there is some benefit there potentially. But I do think that carbs play an important role in not only how you perform, but how you recover. And there's certainly a role for high quality carbohydrates in most people's diet.
So in general, again, sports science and just kind of carb, protein, fat ratios, that probably outweighs the genetic predisposition for people. But people like Mike or I, at least, would probably do better with slightly different diets. Like Mike, you're probably the bone broth. Maybe you eat just the testicle instead of the bone broth with all the saturated fat.
I don't know. I really don't know what I'm not sure what the macronutrients of a testicle are, Matt. So
I'm going to type it into MyFitnessPal. Hold on.
Guessing it's fairly high in fat.
Low carb.
I think I don't think there's very high. I don't know. Maybe, I guess it depends on how active the testicle's been, whether there's high protein in it or not.
No, Matt, I think you're right. I think there is some opportunities to personalize things based on your genetics here, certainly. And especially looking maybe at some data around protein and what percentage of your macros should be made up from protein. And again, it's going to depend on your training and your goals and what kind of event or what your goals are that you're training for. But there are some FTO genotypes that do better with a higher protein diet. So we think maybe 25 to 35% of your macros from protein, and other people who don't do as well with that. And so that's something we can help sort out by looking at your genetics.
There was that one that you sent me, Mark, that I thought was super interesting. I think it was the TCF one, where basically if you eat a lower fat diet, you lose lean muscle mass.
Yeah, I also thought that was super interesting. So if you're looking at the TCFL2, and Matt, you're a TT genotype here. So people in with that SNP, they benefit from a lower percentage of their total energy from fat. So if you look, which kind of flies in the face of what you're doing, but potentially people would optimize their body composition with a lower percentage of their macros from a fat intake. Whereas people that have a CC genotype, if they on a low fat diet, they actually lost lean muscle mass. So these people ideally should have a higher fat diet and avoid kind of this low fat nutrition intervention. So they recommended somewhere between 40 and 45% of your dietary calories coming from fat with that CC genotype.
I think it's also
super
important
interesting
that people don't just look at any of these one SNPs. I mean, we're talking about all these SNPs, and sometimes they have different directional changes if you were just to look at one and make decisions. And that's kind of why the algorithms that we use, we look at all of them together instead of just one at a time. So they're all interesting.
That's an extremely important point. A lot of these SNPs, there's not just one SNP. So when we say the words like FTO SNP, there's not just one FTO SNP. There's actually, I think there's tens of FTO SNPs. So, having one might mean something minimal and then sometimes they have more of an effect than others, but some people have 7 FTO SNPs. So it's important to remember there's a lot that goes into this. It's not just, one SNP equals intervention.
And that these pathways involve multiple genes, and they're also up and down regulated based on all sorts of different things, whether it's diet, exercise, sleep. You can up and down regulate, and the epigenetics around each of these SNPs is also really fascinating as well. So yeah, I totally agree. Just because you do have this one SNP doesn't predispose you absolutely to having to follow a strict macro ratio. I think it's something to take in context with the other genetics and laboratory tests that we have.
But there is one SNP that actually is pretty powerful when it comes to sports performance, and that's the CYP1A2 genotype that actually can give you some good directional information. You want to talk about that one?
I was hoping we were going to talk about this because I think this is probably my favorite. And I think it actually does provide potentially some actionable data that you can offer someone right away based just on this one SNP. So the CYP1A2 genotype regulates how you metabolize caffeine. And so people who are an AA genotype are fast metabolizers of caffeine. The AC group is somewhere in the middle, and then the CC group is a slow metabolizer. So there was a really cool study that came out in 2018 on this, showing that people in that AA genotype, when they took them and did a 10K cycling time trial, when they gave them 4 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine beforehand, it was about 2 cups of coffee for the average size person, they actually got significant time trial improvement. So about a 7% improvement in their 10K cycling time versus people in the CC group who are slow metabolizer. They actually got slower. So they got about 14% slower. So this is the kind of interesting thing when you're looking at people, you show up at a bike race and people are hammering down goo gels either before or after on the line.
Clue whether it's actually going to benefit them or
I
not.
have no
Could
idea.
Make them 14% slower.
Or they're just shaking off their bike because they've had so much coffee before they show up. So it could be something that actually gives you some good actionable information right away.
A couple of comments on this study. I think I just recently looked at this.
Yeah.
I think the people that they studied were not drinking lots of coffee on a regular basis.
Yeah.
They had a low caffeine intake at baseline, which I think is important because, that probably says that, me, somebody who drinks like 3 cups of coffee a day, if I go down, 4 milligrams per kilogram, I'm probably not going to have the same effect on the bike because I've saturated
you'd
my
probably be
adenosine
withdrawing
receptors.
at 4 milligrams per kilogram.
Right. And then I think the other thing that's important to remember is that there also are studies that show that the difference between fast metabolizers and slow metabolizers is also in cardiovascular disease risk and other disease risks.
Sure.
So in general, slow metabolizers probably need to be avoiding caffeine to some extent, or at least not taking large doses of it.
And some other data in the cycling literature showing that probably a max dose of 200 milligrams of caffeine is where you get the benefit. So not something that more is not necessarily better here.
And a gel is what, like 50 milligrams?
Depends on the gel you get. Yeah, there's somewhere between 50 and 100.
So you're not necessarily optimizing the potential there. But I guess if you're taking it like in the middle of an effort, it might be slightly different than trying to take it before the effort.
Yeah, potentially.
Again, this is This is like everything else, though, too, and it depends a little bit. What you said, Mike, about you already taking quite a bit. Maybe these people in these studies weren't. I had a patient just yesterday who I was going over his genetics, and he was CC, slow metabolizer, and he told me that he drinks quite a bit of coffee right before these Spartan races that he does. And I said, maybe you shouldn't. But at the same time, we probably, even though we have this genetic SNP and we have this data, it's probably good to test. So what I suggested to him is actually do a little end of one study, like do a little time trial or something. And one morning drink coffee, another morning drink decaf, and just don't tell yourself, have someone else make it, and then just measure and see how it affects you.
Blinded N of one
That's a great
randomized control trial.
No, I think, and like we were saying, you know, these are complicated pathways, and just because you have one individual SNP, there could be other factors that are playing a role here. And I think the other interesting thing thinking about this is, you know, how much of this has to do with the actual effect on the adenosine receptor of the caffeine versus how much of it is a dopamine signaling motivation pathway where those people who are all jacked up on coffee are just willing to push that much harder. So I don't know. I think it is interesting and definitely deserves a closer look.
I am happier after I have my coffee in the morning, so that might be all it takes.
Mike's N of one study.
Yeah, my N of one, yeah.
Well, I think this has been super interesting. There's a bunch of genetics and SNPs that relate to sports performance, and I always love picking your brain about that, Mark. In general, I just want to echo your point you made at the beginning, though, that just basic sports science and exercise physiology probably trump most of this. But if you've already got that stuff dialed in and you're already performing and you're trying to push the limits of where you are and trying to get that extra little advantage, I think there are some really good information and potentially directional changes you can make. And at least it gives you some ideas of things to try when you get this testing done to go along with the lab tests as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, you have to build that foundation first, but there is some really fascinating data out there. And this is a realm that's expanding all the time as far as how we are going to be able to really dial people's exercise programs and their diet and their recovery in the future based on their genetics. So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out, but also a lot of work to be done.
It might only be that last 5 to 10% right now, but as the AI gets better and we learn about more SNPs, it's going to continue to grow and grow in terms of its percentage of total effort, total performance, probably. Cool. Well, thanks, Mark. This has been really cool.
Yeah. Good luck, Matt, with your cycling 10K time trial.
I'm pretty sure I'm just going to fake a hamstring injury. Or I may just show up with like a neck brace on and just act like I got injured the day before. That's probably what I'll do.
I'd recommend just showing up with 2 flat tires and then just
and some training wheels
and no tubes. Just saying you can't ride.
Best tip of the podcast.
We hope you like listening to the podcast as much as we like making it. If you think it's valuable, share it with somebody. Send to someone you think would really benefit and leave us a 5-star review in iTunes. Those reviews really, really help us out. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram at WildHealthMD. If you didn't like, well, why are you still listening? Email us and let us know what we can do better. But the best way you can thank us for our time is to leave a review and share. Until next time.